Okay, perfect. So the recording is on. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And thank you, William Gairdner, for coming again. This is the third time we are discussing your book, The War Against the Family. This time we are going to try to focus a little more on the second chapter. And how are you today?
Very well, thank you. And thank you once again for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. It's our pleasure. Okay, so let's begin. I would like actually to begin with a general question of guidance. Like I said earlier, I feel that our generation is a bit lost and misguided, and I would like to try to play a small simulation game in which you are the experienced, knowledgeable grandfather, and you're sitting with your grandchild, a man at his 20s or a woman at her 20s. And can you please give us some guidelines, general guidelines on what does it take to live a proper life, a moral life? If you can kindly go ahead.
Oh, my goodness. Not a small question. um, and I can't help echoing my own grandfather. And I think I shared that with you once already, and my own father. I remember my grandfather asking for boldness in voicing your opinions. First of all, the courage to think them through. And I do tell my own grandchildren this. I have 16 of them. The oldest is 20 and the youngest is 3. So the oldest is in university now, and we were chatting just on this last Thanksgiving weekend about this very thing. And I was telling him that he's going to a university now in a frightened society, in universities which have become the center of political correctness. And if you don't mind me saying so, in looking through my own books, especially The War Against the Family, I'm actually a little bit shocked at how much of this was in the air in the late 80s when I was drafting this book. It was published in 93. But all this political correctness stuff was really surfacing then, along with the notion that there are victims of some kind of oppression everywhere: race oppression, class oppression, ideological oppression, and so on. And so the universities, which used to be bastions of freedom in more or less closed societies, have themselves become closed societies. In fact, I would say that the societies surrounding most modern universities, this is not true for all of them, of course, but I would say most modern universities in the Western democracies have become bastions of intellectual and moral oppression. And by the way, they don't shy away from this idea themselves. If you look at almost any survey of the political and moral attitudes of professors in the modern university, they will admit quite freely, if not proudly, most of them proudly, that they're very left liberal in their thinking and in their political choices and in who they vote for. Something like 95% of most faculties in most universities is of that kind. Where you get a difference, of course, is in a more theologically based university or school, like a school of divinity or something like that. But even then, look at the schools of divinity in the Christian West. They've become invaded by left-wing thought, left-wing liberal thought, Marxist thought, and so on. So what do I say to my 20-year-old grandson? You know what I said to him? Excuse the flagrant self-promotion, but I said, I want you to take a copy of my first political book, which is called The Trouble with Canada. Subtitle is A Citizen Speaks Out. And take it with you to university and I'm going to lean on you to read one chapter a month and send me your views and your reaction. Whether you like what I'm saying or you don't like it, I'd like to hear what you have to say, and then we can have a discussion. So that's a long way of answering your question. When it comes down to more practical things, as I say, I tell him in this environment, which is meant to cow him, meant to make him feel like a sheeple, as we say, which in English is a combination of people and sheep. We call them sheeple. Take my grandfather's advice, which is, even if you're going to be wrong, for God's sake, speak up. Like stand your ground, speak your mind. And that brings me to my own father. So I share it with you again. He said, know what you think, say what you think, and do what you say. If most people in the world did that, we'd have a far more open society. And even where views were clashing, we'd at least have some chance of discussing them, whereas we don't now. We really don't. Canada, at least, I don't know about where you live, but Canada has become a very closed and frightened society. Citizens who are invited to dinner somewhere. In fact, I have to say, even when my wife and I are invited to dinner with people who've been friends for decades, but who have kind of slowly, gotten on board with the public mind. My wife and I say to each other, we better not talk about this, or we better not talk about that, because we're just going to upset them. So anyway, that's the kind of advice I give to my grandchildren, broadly speaking. When it comes to particular issues, there's all sorts of other things which we have to share with each other. But I think that's one of the most important ones, is know what you think. And you can't know what you think till you've actually done some thinking about the issues. And then you have to be brave enough to say what you think. I don't mean throw it in somebody's face, insult them, intentionally irritate them or whatever. But any topic can be raised in a calm and thoughtful way. So the other piece of advice I gave this grandson was iron hand and a velvet glove. Don't back down if you feel your principles are being compromised by the discussion. But you don't have to be rude. You don't have to be insulting. And the best way you can make headway in persuading someone to understand what you're thinking is to ask them questions about what they're thinking and try to take their arguments apart. Let's say try to hang them with their own rope. A really good debater learns to do that. He, of course, has his own points of view, but he doesn't throw his rope around the other guy's neck. He lets the other guy make the verbal and logical or illogical rope of his own, and he puts that around his neck and hangs him with that. That happened to me when I was a student at Stanford. This wonderful, dear professor who's now departed and who became like a father to me. We were in his living room one day and I made some cheeky remark about God or something. Oh, William, he said, you don't believe in God? And, I was 25 or something. And I let him have my arguments, which were fairly atheistic at the time, which they're not now. But he just slowly began asking me questions. Questions about causality, questions about the meaning of the universe and who knows what. And I was surprised because I thought he was going to argue with me, but he didn't. He asked me what I thought, and he was quietly summing it up in his mind. And after a certain point, when he had 5 or 6 of my points, he saw the contradictions in them and he threw them back at me, and he completely defeated my position without ever having to raise an argument of his own.
So
And I thought it was brilliant.
So he was basically applying the Socratic approach on you.
Yep, he was, and I didn't even know what that meant at the time, but I got a first-hand lesson in it.
That's very nice. Just a very quick general question. What would you recommend a 22, 23 years old lady? Would you recommend her to focus on a career, or would you say that this is the best time to start and build a family?
I think the latter generally, but I do say that if someone feels, I mean, it's just an expression, but if someone feels that God has spoken to them, that they have some kind of higher purpose in life, then they're going to have to try to work that out along with satisfying their own biological drives and needs and hopes and desires to create a family.
Mm.
I always feel sad when people reject the whole notion of creating a family. And most people don't. Most people do create a family at some point in their lives. But I think postponing these things in our time has been a bit of a disaster for the female sex. I happen to feel that although our entire generation has taken advantage of it, I think the various methods of conception, of contraception and abortion availability, etc., have had a disastrous effect on the formation of families, the postponement of marriage. Although this is interesting too, you notice in this book there are some charts. I forget the chapter, but yeah, it's called The Family at a Glance. And there's some charts in there which are a little outdated now, but not really. They tell an interesting story. And one of the very first charts illustrates the fact that just after the turn of the 20th century, the age of marriage of the average female in Canada, at least, was quite high, in the high 20s. And then as Canada started to become more wealthy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that age started to come down. And right around the Second World War. So you see the curve starting up here and coming down by mid-century, where right after the Second World War, when a lot of people were rushing to marry because war had postponed it, then the age started to rise again. So now it's kind of where it was at the turn of the 20th century, a higher average age of marriage, but for very different reasons. At the turn of the 20th century, the reasons were financial, like economic. If a man wanted to marry a girl, most of them would go to the girl's father, and explain themselves and express their desire to marry the daughter, and then explain to the father how they were going to support his daughter and their children. And it didn't have a pretty good story to tell or any experience that the father could put his faith in. He would probably say, no, I don't think you should marry my daughter now. If you're still interested a couple of years from now, when your circumstances have improved, come and see me again, that sort of thing. But the whole romantic love business, which we see in a kind of contest with these practicalities, I mean, it's been around for a long time. If you look at the 18th, 17th, and 18th century novel, in the English language tradition, at least, certainly in the French tradition too, well, and the Russian. I mean, I've studied only those literatures, really. You can see the war going on. I mean, look at Richardson's novel called Clarissa, which is an epistolary novel written in the 18th century about marriage and love and so on and so on. And this whole clash between the idea of true love and the idea of being ready for true love and ready for marriage. That's all gone now, and the victory has been won by the emotional, spontaneous, romantic view that you get married because you want to, and because you love somebody so much, and all this kind of thing, and you more or less dismiss these practical concerns. But today the marriage age is going up for lots of other reasons. Available contraception, contraception is everywhere, and I think it's really affected the emotional psyche of young women with respect to marriage. Also, the insistence on what one American writer describes as the androgyny hoax, this idea that there's no real difference between men and women anyway. And we're seeing that everywhere today. It's come back with a vengeance. It was around in the 90s. A wonderful scholar named Alan Carlson, who used to be with the Rockford Institute in Illinois, wrote a whole book called Family Questions. And one of his essays in that book is called The Androgyny Hoax. And one of the things he says in that chapter is that anybody who's raised both boys and girls who still thinks they're alike has already resisted more evidence to the contrary than any experiment could ever supply. But it's here everywhere now in our society. And if you actually question a parent who's giving her little girls fire engines and trucks, and giving the little boys dolls and things like that because she wants to adjust their attitudes and make everybody androgynous, you're going to run into a wall. We actually have a good friend who did that. She had three daughters, no sons, and she wanted to alter their perception of the world. So she bought them fire engines and trucks and things like that. Her name is Bella. She's a lovely woman. And so this went on for a year or so, a couple of years. And one day I said, Bella, how's your experiment worked out? And she said, not very well. She said, I gave my daughter her first fire engine and she played with it and had a great old time. But that night when I went up to tuck her into bed, the fire engine was in her doll crib with a blanket and a bottle.
That's very nice. Very
So, nature trumps everything, really.
nice.
But, I guess I was going to say, don't get me going. We are living in a radically egalitarian age, and the victim of egalitarianism in our time, unfortunately, is civil society. And the reason is that civil societies only get strong and only stay strong in the first place is because they create privileges for their members. The family, for example, is a privilege-generating institution, which is one of the things Plato didn't like about it. Marx and Engels hated, and they just advocated destroying the family entirely. And all radical feminists really despise the idea of the traditional family structure because it creates privilege for its members only, not for everybody in society. And of course, the egalitarian state has set its sights on the destruction of privileges of all kinds. Everyone shall have the same benefits, social benefits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that the government can provide. Privilege is frowned upon. So we have a war. It's been going on for a long, long time, but most openly in the last, I say, since World War II. And now it's just screaming. Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to speak about the 10 popular illusions in your second chapter, and you are
Yep.
starting with the individualism illusion. Can you explain what that to us and what is moral agency, please?
I will.
Thank you.
I think individualism is a healthy thing in many respects, and we all know that. But not if it's advanced as a principle, and used as a battering ram for the destruction of such institutions as the family, which it has been. I call this hyper individualism. In the best sense, we start with the idea of the free individual, because only a free individual can make adequate moral choices. And we move from those moral choices to the construction of a moral society. And this helps us create the notion of community. All these things are possible in a free society when individualism is rightly developed. But when individualism goes too far and it becomes the only political principle in the minds of the people, then everything changes. Let me give you a metaphor to help your listeners understand this. I think in traditional societies, there's some kind of notion that we all live inside a common moral bubble, let's say. It's like an invisible tent, which is over everybody in our society. And we all live by the same rules. We all know that might does not make right, and you should honor your debts and keep your vows, and all sorts of things that go into the construction of the set of ideas which operates inside that moral bubble. But with radical individualism, which is the only thing I'm taking aim at here, the idea is that each individual has their own moral bubble, nuts to the common moral bubble. Why should I be bending to your idea of the good and the true when I can create my own? So in the 1980s, for example, and you see this in War Against the Family, there's a whole chapter on this business in the schools called MVE, or Moral Values Education. Now, the root of moral values education, which has diminished a bit, I must say, now, because it got teachers in lots of trouble with parents when their kids started running around deciding that they didn't need the 10 Commandments and they didn't need dictates from Ma and Pa about how to behave, or from anybody, that they would be really more authentic if they made up their own sense of right and wrong and stood on that ground. So lots of parents went running into the schools and said, what the hell are you teaching our children? That they're the arbiters of right and wrong, that this does not come from our tradition, our religion, our philosophical precepts. Please, give me a break. But that was in the air for a long time. And anybody out there listening to this show who's a parent, you better be sitting down when you read about moral values education in my book. There's about 4 chapters on education in this book. And where I treat that topic is in the chapter called Looking After Their Souls. And what you're going to read there is from, well-known so-called experts in moral teaching will shock you, especially when it comes to the notions of sexual education and how sex ed, probably beginning most notably in countries like Sweden, and I have a whole chapter on Sweden in War Against the Family. Sex came to be considered a kind of wedge issue that teachers could use to disassociate children from parental authority in their own homes. In other words, they could diminish and reduce the influence of morality in the private home by teaching children about sex in ways that their parents weren't. Now, it is true that most parents are lamentable when it comes to talking about sex with their own children, too embarrassed, too whatever. But teachers have more than taken this on with relish. And I'm afraid to say that one of the reasons is they can sneak in all kinds of attitudes about the world at large, along with the sex education that they know the kids are not going to hear at home. So even in this section on the popular illusions, you will see some quotations from Swedish experts about how the whole purpose of sex really sex education rather, is to change society. Sweden, by the way, was the poster boy. That's the expression, I guess. Was the poster boy for this. It was a very, very traditional society for hundreds of years. And then in the early part of, and I think I mentioned this in our last talk, a few of the really big guns there, well, one of them was named Gunnar Myrdal and his wife Alva. They began to see that through sex ed, they could restructure society against the parents and reduce the importance of sexual behavior. I mean, I am circling around to your question here about marriage and family, and make sexual life seem simply functional, not particularly romantic, but simply a functional aspect of reality, like having dinner. You know, and even the verb, you have sex. You know, you don't make love anymore. That's maybe up to you. I don't know. But you have sex just like you have dinner, you know, or you have other things.
Yeah.
This was an effort to instrumentalize sex and thus to weaken the influence of the parents by eliminating the mystery of human sexuality from the minds of the children, and thus opening them to a whole bunch of social engineering, which would have been difficult to plant in their little minds without that. For example, a kid goes to a teacher and says, "Teacher, I really have sexual feelings. You know, I'm only 13 or 14 years old, but I have sexual feelings. What should I do?" Well, the mother and father would probably say something like, "These feelings are important. It's important that you understand them, and there will come a time when, you know, expressing them will be natural, but you're too young," and so on and so on. But the teacher is going to say something quite different. She or he is going to undermine the family and say, "Oh, interesting. Well, you know, as long as you protect yourself, and here's a condom, if it's a guy, you know, whatever, here's a condom, or if it's a girl, here's a package of contraceptive pills, which they can distribute to students without telling their parents." Just like in many schools in North America, so-called sex counselors can arrange for abortions for young girls without ever telling the parents that the girl's pregnant in the first place. There are some jurisdictions where that's totally not allowed, because in America in particular, they really differ in terms of sex ed by state. Lots of states have very different laws from each other. It's not like a federal issue. Nevertheless, these instrumental sexual methodologies for reorganizing society are generated in the teachers' colleges of the world. In Canada, Columbia University is in America, Columbia University is especially noted for this. In Canada, it's an institution in Ontario, the province I live in, called the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education. My daughter went there because you can't teach in Ontario without getting a certificate from that institution. And she was absolutely shocked. Almost her first week at this institution, and she's a really smart girl, they're starting to talk to her about how normal things like homosexuality are, and how abortion is a girl's right, and all this kind of thing. And she decided to do what her dad told her, which is know what you think and say what you think. So she stood up to speak, and there were 400 would-be teachers in the room, and they were just shocked to hear this young girl. She was like, I think 23 at the time, stand up and speak her mind about how she disagreed with the teacher on various of these points. And the fellow sitting beside her was an immigrant from Romania. He was about 50 years old, and he came here for a new life, which is wonderful. But when Ruthann sat down, he turned to her, and I'm manufacturing his accent a bit, but he said, Ruthann, he said, shut up. He said, you shut up, you just get your degree, and when you are in your school, you close the door and you tell the students what you want. But here you just shut up, he said, because you cannot win. Well, in other words, the ideological pressure was so intense that she was going to lose every time. Well, then he told her that he fled from Romania because he translated George Orwell's little book called Animal Farm, which was a kind of send up of totalitarian systems. He translated it into Romanian, and he said that he fled Romania with machine guns at his back. He said they were firing at me when I got over the border. And now I'm in Canada, he said. And everything you are hearing in this institution, he said, is almost word for word what I heard in Romania institutions. Same kind of sentences, same word order, same concepts being shoved down our throats.
Yes.
And I thought that was kind of scary, because if you turn to most Canadians today and tell them that Canada has entered into a stage of soft totalitarianism, they look at you a little bit funny, like you're an extremist. Well, I'm no extremist. I'm someone who's very eager to find the truth and focus on it and think about it and write about it clearly for the benefit of others.
Mhm.
I'm no, but Canada is a soft totalitarian country. In other words, there's no machine guns in the streets. We don't have guards standing at the corner. Like my professor at Stanford, his mother was Romanian, actually, which is a coincidence, given the story I just told you. No connection. But they wouldn't let her leave Romania. And she said there was always a guard on the corner of her street in her neighborhood, smoking cigarettes, walking around with his machine gun, doing nothing, but spying on everybody, and
Yes.
and so like I sold my business because the government was telling me how much I had to pay my employees. It was telling me how many women I had to hire in my business. And not only that, but it limited how much I was allowed to charge for my product. And I
Yes.
said, I'm getting out. I want to become a writer. So I have to sell my business so that I have enough money to write books, because you can't earn much money from books like these. But so that's what I did. I said, you can't run a business when the government's telling you, who to hire, how much to pay them, and what you can and cannot charge for what you're selling.
Yes.
But that's true in Canada.
Mhm. Um, Actually, you mentioned the Animal Farm. I think we are starting to see 1984 all over the place. This is how I see reality today.
Yes.
Um, I would like to ask a very uncomfortable question. Do you see a correlation or maybe even causality between the amount of sexual partnerships women and men have and their inability to maintain their marriage life later on?
If I understand you, you're asking me if when young people have a lot of sexual relationships, does that make married life difficult afterwards?
Yes, if they are less compatible for marriage life.
Well, I think it would. Um, and by the way, that's been the intent. It was the intent of the Swedes and of Canadian teachers who've taken on the Swedish lesson. This is not true of all teachers, by the way. There are lots of teachers who don't. But in general, I would say that has held sway in institutions like the one I was just describing to you, which is what cranks out the teachers. So the whole idea is to diminish the importance of life, sexuality in private life. And if you do that, you diminish the importance of sex in marriage. And again, I think I mentioned last time, marriage in Canada is now impossible in the strict sense of the word, because, and I put it in simple terms, it takes two to make it, but one to break it. So just like a Muslim, a Christian person, uh, or any kind of person can walk into his home at night and walk up to his wife Or she can walk up to her husband and just say, I want a divorce. And the
Yeah.
whole thing starts.
I'm
It's
bored.
not,
That's
it's
the
not
main
like,
reason for divorce today. I'm just bored.
I'm what?
I'm bored. Bored.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. If they're bored, tired of life, or they found a new lover or whatever, and they want out. So they just say, I want a divorce. But they do not need the consent of their partner. Now, their partner may have been the most observant individual in the world who observed everything and all the faith of the marriage, but it doesn't matter. And so that means you can't actually get married in the traditional sense of the word, which requires two to make it, two to break it.
I understand.
Yeah.
Um, in the second chapter, you're speaking about two kinds of communities. One which begins with freedom, leads to individualism and cooperation, and the other one that starts from the up to the bottom, which is communalism, coercion, and obedience. Can you
Yes.
explain a little about that?
Yeah, I think I was just trying to make a distinction between the different kinds of community at which different types of government are aiming. In free societies, and there's a diagram in the book on page 24 which explains what you just outlined. True community begins with freedom, which gives rise to true individualism, which is not what I have criticized here, hyper individualism. Okay, it's individualism that recognizes responsibilities and the importance of civil organizations and so on. And that produces cooperation. And from that, you get community. But in totalitarian states, or what I call top down societies, as opposed to the former type, which is kind of bottom up society, it begins with obedience, coercion, and communalism. But communalism and community are two different things. The first is freely generated, and the second is coerced or imposed. And there's been lots of examples of that in history, and they never work in the long run. Mostly because they completely ignore the aspect of responsibility, moral and otherwise, which goes along with true freedom. So utopian states and so on, you can find uh, their notion. Well, like North Korea. North Korea is all about communalism, and they boast about it, but it's imposed and forced and top down. It's not true community, which is sustained voluntarily by free people.
Yes.
So,
Um, can you explain the freedom illusion and the difference between freedom and liberty, please?
yes, I will. Not everyone may agree, but in that chapter, I try to make various distinctions between freedom and liberty. And I realize the two words are used almost interchangeably, but I think of freedom in the sense of human beings are always free internally. Even the man in jail is free in the sense that he can make moral choices which may have an effect on the world inside or outside the jail. There's a famous story that Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, I can't remember it now, about a fellow who's hiding from the Nazis during the war. And he's got a buddy, and they've agreed to meet at point A at 3 o'clock or whatever. And his buddy's hiding under another bridge somewhere in Paris. But the Nazis find the first fellow, and they torture him to tell him where his buddy is. And he lies. And even though he's a captive, he's free in the sense that he can tell the truth or lie. So the irony is that he lies. He tells them that his buddy is hiding out in the church, whereas in fact he's under a bridge, supposed to be under a bridge somewhere else. Well, unbeknownst to the first fellow, his buddy decided that the bridge wasn't safe, and in fact he went to the church. So the free fellow ended up being responsible for his buddy getting caught, even though that was not his intent. But it didn't. I'm sorry to elaborate here, but it was a very interesting story because of the moral bind that it put him in post facto. But my point is that even in jail, behind bars, someone can affect the world outside them because they're still free, but they're not at liberty. Liberty has to do with more physical sense of, and we even use that expression in English. We say that a man who's escaped from jail is at liberty, and the police are chasing him and trying to catch him, but he's at liberty, which is the kind of language that we use. So, but in the book, there's a kind of analysis of the different kinds of freedom, and I think readers, if they get to it, will be interested in that. Another, and by the way, this whole chapter on the popular illusions was created after a similar chapter in my first book, The Trouble with Canada, which, by the way, is not just about Canada. A lot of Americans and English people who read that book write to me and they say, you know, all you have to do is change some of the terms, and what you're saying is totally applicable to America or England or whatever country they happen to live in. Into the West, yeah. Democratic systems in the West. There's a chapter there also called The Popular Illusions. Because what struck me when I wrote both these books was how the public is drifting along, believing certain things to be true, I call them illusions, which in fact are not true. But those are the illusions that are driving public policy. And we can't change anything for the better until we understand what the illusions are and help people abandon those illusions and take hold of the truth. You mentioned earlier the what I call the three blows from Freud and Einstein and Darwin.
And Copernicus.
Yeah, I call the relativity illusion basically, and I bunched them all under that. All those really have been blows in the West. The Copernican one we all know about. I mean, can you imagine people back in the time of Copernicus who thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, really? And in fact, there's a word in Old English which kind of gives you the image of that. The word is middenjerde. And middenjerde is an Anglo-Saxon word which means middle earth. So there's earth above, which is heaven, and there's earth below, which is hell. This is middenjerde, which is the middle earth, you know. So people used to conceive of the world that we live on in that way. It was kind of the middle earth. So when the story came along that in fact the earth is rotating around the sun and not the other way around, this was profoundly shocking and led to all kinds of questions about God, of course, and destroyed the faith of a lot of people. And by the way, that whole effect is being striven for today by all kinds of scientists who are just dying to find water on Mars, for example. Every time we read an article about Mars, what's there water on Mars? Look, it could have been a river. It looks like a rivulet, or, you know, the way the sand is shaped or something like that. Well, I don't know whether there was ever water on Mars or not. And I don't think anybody does. It's really sophisticated speculation whether there was or wasn't water that would, you know, form life. But the whole motive, and they don't say so because they don't want to upset everybody, but the whole motive of these kinds of very secular-oriented physical scientists is they want to disprove the notion of God. They want to do away with it forever and stand upon the notion that the universe created itself. If you tell them there's a really interesting correlation between the Big Bang theory and modern physics and astronomy and cosmology and the notion of creation by God in an instant, Why is that? Well, they'll change the subject. And then if you try some of the logic of the ancients, which is wonderful logic, and say, well, the universe could not have created itself, could it? And they say, well, sure it could. And you say, well, how could something create itself? Because in order to create itself, it would have to precede itself in existence, wouldn't it? In other words, it would have to be here before it was here. How does that make sense? And you're going to get a lot of silence, and they go have a drink with someone else. See, because they can't answer the logical conundrum. The last time I was in Venice on a vacation with my wife, we went to find a wonderful little restaurant. We wanted like a really Italian restaurant without all the tourists. So we found one, but the only place they had a table for us happened to be sitting beside the only American in the restaurant. And I can't remember his name now, but he was a very interesting man who was behind the creation of the Hubble telescope. And well, talk about interesting for me, because at the time I had a very large backyard telescope of my own. It was a 14-inch celestron. That's the size of the actual aperture of the telescope, which is quite large, and it was a wonderful experience. And so I wanted to ask some questions. So I asked him this question, and I said, I used the Latin. I said, ex nihilo nihil fit, which in Latin means out of nothing comes nothing. Like if there really was nothing before the universe began, then how could there be something? Because you can't get something from nothing. And he turned to me and he said, we see matter being going in and out of creation all the time. Well, he was talking about at the atomic level, particles coming into existence and then disappearing, etc. And I said, yeah, but they're not coming out of nothing. There are laws of physics, which are pretty much fixed as far as we know. And there's a lot of them, and they operate everywhere in the universe. So you can't say there's something coming out of nothing. It's coming out of something. So the question is then, if you want to go back, is where did the laws come from that are coordinating all this? Well, so he decided to finish his beer instead of the conversation. But it was good fun anyway.
William, can you speak a little more about what evolution and especially Freud did to the destruction of the original hierarchy of values? Because before we had God on the level of metaphysics and morals and how do we know what we know, and suddenly everything changed, especially with Freud, whom I personally think he was a criminal. So can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, first of all, I think I should mention that, and I'm no expert at it, but I think I should mention that as far as I remember, there's a lot of good research out there today on psychiatric patients indicating that the recovery rates and the healing rates of people who are in deep psychological trouble are just as good if you do nothing as they are if people submit to Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud, by the way, was a brilliant man in his own right. He had lots of interests, including literary interest and aesthetic interest. He wrote a lot about literature and the arts, essays which are quite interesting. But it seems to me that he bestialized human beings, and he created a kind of myth about how and why people are what they are and how they behave, why they behave the way they behave. It was a kind of mythology that I don't think is taken too seriously anymore. Other types of psychiatric analysis have come into being, and one of the things that interests me is existential psychoanalysis because it's more philosophical. What it basically argues is that the greatest problems most people have, and I'm not talking now about chemical problems, brain neuron problems and that neurological problems of psychiatry. I'm talking about the attitudinal stuff. Most of the problems they have are in the search for meaning. I remember the book Man's Search for Meaning. You probably remember the author better than I do, but it was a
I
fine
think
book
Frank, right?
called Man's Search for Meaning. And then there's people like Rollo May in the US and others who kicked off something called existential psychoanalysis, which has to do with the search for meaning. And if I were a psychiatrist, that's the field that I would be in, because I think a lot of modern psychological problems, especially with mature young people, I don't mean little kids, but young adults, have to do with the fact that they're lost in a world which has kicked God out of the building and left them abandoned to find meaning for themselves without helping them very much at all. So, these are, we are living in a very strained and difficult time in which you might say the elders of society have abandoned the young. And even worse than that, if you don't mind me speculating further, the young have almost abandoned the elderly, in the sense that it used to be that wisdom tended to trickle down from the top. People who had a lot of experience, and how can you actually know certain things without a lot of experience? Take a father teaching his kid how to hammer a nail. Look, if you hold it that way, you're going to hit your thumb. You hold it this way, all right? And then your thumb's out of the way, that kind of stuff. Practical things, from practical things to life lessons, the assumption used to be that they came from the top down, from people who had the experience and could share it with the younger. Now it's kind of flipped on its head. And I must say, I, for one, and I'm not completely stupid when it comes to computers and iPhones and things like that. I do get it, and I am able to cope with them, but I don't spend much time thinking about those things. Whereas a lot of young people today, they're always on their screens, and they know all about the fastest and best devices and what you have to do to convert this to that. And it's like they're teaching older people how the world works, and they're not interested in wisdom from the older people as much as they used to be, because they don't figure they need it. Sex, you can't talk to me about sex. You don't know anything. You're an old goat, right? We just do what we want. We hook up when we want. All the girls I know, they're on the pill anyway, that kind of stuff. Abortions, there's pills for the abortion too. And even if there aren't, they just, go to the doctor and get it done. So I'm not concerned about that. Don't talk to me about sex, marriage and the family. When we make enough money. I met a couple last weekend. They just got engaged. When are you getting married? Well, 2006 or something like that. I said, what are you waiting for? They said, well, till we have enough money. And I said, that's not how you make money. How you make money is you get married and have the kids, and that changes your mind about the kind of work you should be doing and how hard you should be working. You got it backwards. They just look at me like I was from Mars, So what can you say? The world is upside down, and I think that's the title of
your next book.
No, it's already been taken. People have written books called "The World Is Upside Down." Actually, a very interesting British historian named Christopher Hill, I think his name is, wrote a book about the English Revolution in which he talked about the world turned upside down. And I happen to be interested in that topic because I wrote a book on democracy, which I'm going to say I wish everybody would read, but I don't think they will. It's another big book. It's an examination of the idea of democracy from the Greeks and Romans up into yesterday, in our own systems. And it was really interesting to read to read about the English Revolution, where the idea of an egalitarian society was put forth by people called the levelers. That better give away what they were thinking. They were called levelers. They wanted to level everything in society. That's what the kibbutz wanted to do in Israel, and that's what all sorts of commune type communities have tried to do over the last couple of centuries, none of which have succeeded. The most famous, of course, was the communist system, which is still going at it in places like Korea and Cuba in a modified sort of way. But you know, these systems are all trying to level. And during the English Revolution, the soldiers got this idea that they loved an egalitarian society. They didn't use the word egalitarian. They talked about leveling. But they seriously argued in one of their debates that the soldiers, listen to this, the soldiers should be giving orders to the generals. In other words, they would get together and have a little confab and decide which tactics the army should engage in and tell the generals what they wanted them to do.
Insane.
That's how upside down their world was. You know, it's like the sailors on the ship who know the least about navigation telling the captain how to steer.
Mm-hmm. By the way, the author you were mentioning earlier is Viktor Frankl.
Viktor Frankl, that's right.
Yeah, an Holocaust
Well,
survivor.
he's an example of an early example of an existential psychiatrist of sorts, and it is very interesting because it causes that sort of analysis causes a deep confrontation with the meaninglessness which happens to exist at the heart of so many young people today without them even knowing it. They don't even know that they have no basis in meaning. They take it as normal that there is no meaning to anything. There's no God. There's no meaning to the universe. It created itself, you know, and one day we're going to find water on Mars, and that will prove to you that, you know, life can happen anywhere. What's the big deal? That's sort of their attitude. It's not until you sit down and actually ask them deeply philosophical questions that they start to stumble and realize the emptiness of their heads when it comes to meaning, and that they're going to have to do some hard inner searching, like Franco said, to find meaning in their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. I would like to focus a little more about the ideal moral absolutes compared with the feel-good ethics. The feel-good ethics is, I think, one of the reasons for our predicament. So if you can speak about that a little.
Well, I will, and I probably held this up last time. I'm going to do a little advertising.
Very good.
This is my book. I wrote it and published it in 2008. It's called The Book of Absolutes. And the subtitle is A Critique of Relativism and a Defense of Universals. It was published by McGill Queen's University Press, which makes me quite proud. I mean, that's very good press. And the reason for the book, as I mentioned, I think last time, was going to parties and hearing people saying, trotting out this stupid phrase, well, it's true for you, but it's not true for me. And again, I say, well, it can't be true and false at the same time. One of us must be wrong. But they especially say this sort of thing when it comes to morals, which is the question you just asked. So one of the things, one of the topics that I got deeply involved in that book was a chapter on natural law. Natural law, which has existed since forever, which was specifically are articulated by people like Cicero in ancient times, and which you can find at the heart of almost every religion in the world, and which you can also find, if you look deeply enough, buried somewhat, even in modern law schools, which reject the idea of natural law in favor of what they call positive law. So positive law is basically any rule or law made by any entity which has command of the society and is duly constituted. That's a rough definition of positive law. But natural law, of course, is rooted in something very, very different. Um, I think Aquinas said it best when he said, um, lex injusta non est lex, which translated means an unjust law is not a law. Um, I would differ even with him. It's, I hope not too bold, in saying that it may be called a law, but it does not have the moral allegiance of the people if it's obviously an unjust law. And in that sense, it's not a law and should not be called a law. Now, it's interesting that at the Nuremberg trials, after the whole 12 years of the Nazi experience, at the Nuremberg trials, the judges, try as they might, had no grounds to convict the war criminals without recourse to natural law. And so they basically stood on that phrase, which I just quoted to you, that an unjust law is not a law, to condemn those war criminals who complained, of course, well, we were just following the law. We were doing what we were told. And if we didn't do it, we would have got shot ourselves. What did you expect us to do? And the court would basically say you were executing the orders of an unjust law, and you knew it was an unjust law, but you went ahead and did it anyway. That sort of thing. So anyway, in the Book of Absolutes, you will find 2 chapters on the natural law. One, as I have just explained, and the other one on international law, which also is a form of natural law. Countries and nations and tribes and cultures agreeing on various legal and moral standards that have never actually spoken with each other before, and yet they have come up with agreement on these very same standards in their own way. And the other chapter in that book, which I think your listeners would find very interesting, is called Human Universals. And it's rooted in the notion, and I may have, again, I'm sorry to be repeating myself, but it was really interesting how the author of the book called Human Universals, with whom I was in touch before I wrote my chapter of that name. He was a typical relativist, moral relativist, and he felt that all morals are relative. And when he was challenged by an anthropologist who said, that's not true. Certain things are common and universal for all peoples of the world at all times. And here's one of them. I bet you can't disprove it. Well, he tried, but he couldn't disprove it. And this went on until finally he became a convert himself and wrote a famous book called Human Universals. So it's a myth of our times that morals are relative. It's a myth of our times that something is true for you, but not true for me. And therefore you're okay, I'm okay, and all the rest of it. Human beings have always focused on a certain set of moral precepts which run through every culture at all points in history. And if you're interested in what they are, you have to go get the Book of Absolutes. And I think, pardon the flagrant self-promotion, but I think you'll enjoy it. You'll enjoy it. And when that book first came out, you wouldn't believe how many people wrote to me and said, thank God, somebody finally said these things. Somebody finally put it between 2 covers. Well, there are hundreds of absolutes, thousands of absolutes in that book. Moral, physical, all anthropological, linguistic, all kinds of absolutes and universals in that book. First time, really, it's been put, that much of it, of human universals has been put between 2 covers.
You're always welcome to promote your work. Your work is our pleasure. It's how we educate ourselves. So feel very comfortable about that, please. The
Thank
book is
you.
still in print. It's available.
Yes, from McGill Queen's University Press. And if you want a used copy, you can get it from Abe Books, that kind of website. And
I will get it myself. I really want to read it.
yes, well, I think you're going to enjoy it. It's a fortifying book. It gives substance to the intuition you probably already have that the relativism is a lie. And by the way, relativism itself is an odd sort of word. You know, people think that Einstein, for example, was the head relativist of Western society. In fact, Einstein, for the rest of his life, I mean, after his theory came out, regretted that he hadn't used his original title, which is the theory of invariance. He was interested in invariance, not in relativity. And as part of his argument, you'll see in my chapter on physics, is that the universe looks the same to everyone, given the parameters that he's discussing. There's nothing relative about it. Uh, so that's a shocking thing to hear until you read his own words and look at the proofs in the chapter on physics in my book.
Yes, actually, the statement "there is no such thing as truth" is an oxymoron because that by itself is a true statement. So
Yeah, that's right.
yes,
That's right. Well, the first part of the book, there's a chapter on how relativism is a self-defeating philosophy. Uh, because if it's true that everything is relative, then even that statement is relative and not true.
yeah.
Just as you were saying. So
Hmm.
I had some I had some fun with that in the first part of the book.
Yes. I would like to try to see if we have a few questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. So, guys, if you have any question, please raise your hand and make it quick, polite, and direct if there is a question.
By the way, what you just said is great advice for the young.
Which one? The
What you just said
Direct.
about people asking questions.
hmm
Quick, make it quick,
Yeah.
and so on.
Um, Alex, do
And
you have any question?
No, I just wanted to ask if I could have a link to a link to William's book so that we can put it on the website and the resources.
I put
if
it in our group already earlier. You can find it 1 second.
I'll
yeah,
have a
and
Here.
look. Fabulous.
if anyone wants to go to my website, and I encourage you to, it's williamgairdner.ca. You'll see all my books there, and under each book, after a description of the book, there's a little link you can click to order the book right from the website. Which
That's
I mean, it
fantastic. Yeah, we'll
takes
use
you to
that.
Amazon. Yeah.
Yeah, which we highly recommend. I put the link to your webpage again in our channel right
Thank
now.
you. Thank you.
Thank
You're
you,
very
Barry.
welcome. 1 second. So I think we don't have questions, unfortunately. Um, would you like to continue for today, or because we
Sure.
are
Let's
already going for 1 hour and 10 minutes? Do you feel
a few,
comfortable to continue?
a few more moments, if you like. For me to go back and look at this book, I'm actually I don't read it every day, of course. I mean, this was written 30 years ago, and I'm shocked to run across some of the things that I said 30 years ago because it's like I was talking about the roots in the ground which have sprouted since, like it's all here. In other words, I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but the book was warning people about political correctness and all this kind of thing. And here it all is. And I see there's a section under popular illusions called the victim illusion. Well, I don't know what's going on where you live, but here in Canada and in the USA, this victim thing is everywhere because there's a form of pseudo Marxist thinking which has become front and center, um, where everyone is pointing their fingers at something, which is oppressing somebody. In other words, everybody is a victim of something. And so I have a section in this book 30 years ago called The Victim Illusion. And I'm just going to read a sentence. I say, once a society loses its sense of community, it starts to crumble, breaking into innumerable groups with no common belief system. Thus begins a feeding frenzy in which each group attempts first to see it set itself up as distinct, and then to employ a special strategy to get everything it can from society at the lowest cost to itself. And this goes on to explain how it is this victimization takes center stage, and it's never ending. It doesn't matter whether it's whites oppressing blacks, or men oppressing women, or rich people oppressing the poor. The victim illusion is everywhere, and I think it's something we should be very concerned about, because it is taking society apart. I have a friend, by the way, whose business is he gets hired to talk to corporations and other organizations about this very kind of thing. And I said to him, Hammond, I said, everywhere you look, every rug you turn over, you're seeing a victim of something. How can you live like that? If you're going to go make money from it and run a nice, tidy little business, good on you, mate, as they say. But I hope you don't believe it, because how can people actually get through life with their heads held up if they always see themselves as a victim of something, of some other group? But that came from Marx in the middle of the 19th century, and we all know how that happened. I mean, economic oppression of the workers, workers of the world unite and all that kind of stuff. Well, for those who are interested, otherwise I don't recommend it, but if you are interested, there's a very in-depth chapter on Marx near the end of my book called The Trouble with Democracy. There's also a very in-depth chapter on the National Socialism, and the two chapters can be compared. But in the Marx thing in particular, you can see that what he was getting at was the perfect society by ending all oppression. In other words, ending all victimhood everywhere it could be seen. And all that's happened today with cultural Marxism is that we're seeing it everywhere, not just in economic terms. And I should also mention here, if you don't mind, to get through this popular illusions chapter, the tolerance illusion. My son called me the other day because his young kids, very young kids, are beginning school, and the teacher got started with this sexual talk, even at grade 1. I don't know, because his daughter came home with a book about how Susie has 2 mummies and all that kind of stuff. And my son hit the roof, and he went to see the principal of the school. And the principal, I mean, God help him dealing with my son. You would not want to tangle with him. He tied the principal in knots over this and then left. But I said, you asked me earlier, Harry, what do I advise the young? Well, that's one thing I advise them. Go into the schools, talk to those people. You're a parent. It's your kids whose minds they're trying to change. Get off your butt and go in there and confront them. You don't have to be rude about it, but you do have to be strong. So my son called me afterwards, and he said, what do I do about all this business of, tolerance and all that kind of stuff? And I said, well, toleration does not mean normalization. It's possible in a free society to tolerate all sorts of things as long as they're not criminal or hurting someone else, but it doesn't mean you have to normalize them. And my personal objection to all this sexual reconstruction of the West, that's going on in the Western democracies, again, in War Against the Family, you'll see it in detail. And you better be sitting down, as I say. One of my complaints about it is that it tries to normalize the abnormal. Whereas for most of history, people have always said, even if quietly to each other, look, it's abnormal and I don't like it, but I'm going to tolerate it as long as you don't push it on my children, change the textbooks in the schools to normalize this stuff and so on. I'm not taking aim in particular at any one abnormality here. For example, I think homosexuality is a disorder of the soul, but there are lots of disorders of the souls. And when my grandson came home from school, he wasn't exactly crying with frustration, but he was, because he said, "Dad, Grandpa," he said, "there's posters all over my school saying gay is okay." Grandpa, he says, "Is it okay?" He didn't even know what it meant. And I had to sit him down and explain what they were saying is okay. And he just turned to me, he said, "That's disgusting." And a little kid, out of the mouths of babes, and so on comes the truth. But I still think I'm a classical liberal, if you like, in many of these respects. I'm a conservative, but I'm a Burkean conservative in moral matters. And I think it's important for us to try to fight to go back to the idea that we can tolerate lots of things that we don't like, but let us not get brainwashed and bullied into normalizing them, which is what the school was doing to my grandson, who's trying to normalize something that maybe they should tolerate, but they shouldn't be normalizing it. So anyway, so much for the tolerance illusion. Another one I wanted to finish with was what I call the rights illusion. Now rights is a special topic which can be very complicated. If you ask somebody what's a right, you might be surprised what they say. They'll probably start by saying nothing because no one's ever asked them before.
It's an
Really,
obligation on another. That's what it is nowadays.
it's what?
It's an obligation on someone else through the welfare state and through the power of the government.
Yeah, okay. I think that's correct in many respects, but it's a very complicated subject in political philosophy, and it's hard to get a clear description of what a right is. And what I come down to is a very simple formula. I say, at its most basic form, a right is really an enforceable claim. It's a claim that somebody wants enforced. And if it can't be enforced, it doesn't matter what they claim, at least in the sense of getting it done. For example, I'm sitting in a private property. We have a nice property here. Sometimes people come walking right through it because we border the forest, excuse me, and they just decide to come walking through our property. And often I don't mind. I mean, it's a nice day, but sometimes I say, "Excuse me, this is private property." "Oh, really?" And that sort of thing. And they leave. But if there were no police around, or I weren't strong enough to do something about it myself, I couldn't say I have a private property right, except on a piece of paper, because I wouldn't be able to enforce it. Mm-hmm. But because there are police and so on, and in a bad circumstance, I could get it enforced for me. Excuse me.
Bless you.
So anyway, the rights illusion is rampant in our society, and it starts with the idea that people have wants. And it migrates, they turn the want into a need. They start to claim that this is not just a want anymore, something that I want, it's something that I need. And then the word need soon becomes a right. And then the right becomes a claim, usually a claim against the government or against you or your neighbors or somebody. In a socialized society like Canada, I'm not going to say socialist because Canada is not a real socialist country, but it's a kind of managerial entitlement social welfare state in which there is a big sort of private life and private sector, but the government tries to do as much as it can for everybody equally coast to coast on top of that. But anyway, this progression from wants to needs to rights to claims is what's been happening in our society. I mean, you'll see when you read this chapter, there's even some funny things in there about people standing up and protesting that they have a right to a toilet. You know, the UN, I think, actually went public and said that all human beings have a right to a toilet. Who knows what that means? You know, it means, and I knew someone years ago, he said to me that he had a right to marry. And I said, what do you mean you have a right? What do you mean you have a right to marry? And he said, well, I do have a right to marry. I said, you're implying someone else has an obligation to marry you, aren't you? Isn't that what you mean? What you have
That's
to
exactly
mean?
what it means. Yes.
Yeah, and he laughed, of course, which was good of him. But I said, you know, but the right has become a lazy word, which is being bandied about for all sorts of bad reasons. We have a kind of wholesale rights fever in our country. I don't know about yours, but it's everywhere. If you want something, you just start saying, it's my right, and hope someone will stand up and give it to you, paid for by others, of course.
Of course.
Here's another one I call the equality illusion, which always has struck me as odd because nothing in life is equal ever to anything else, really. It's hard to find two things that are equal. And in fact, most things in life fall, when you start looking at them, they fall into some kind of normal curve where the inequalities between them take a standard bell curve shape. You know, the standard bell curve is divided into about 8 little compartments, and it looks like a bell. And for normal distribution, that's what you see when you start looking at most phenomena, as long as they have enough of them. Even in things like, say, a marathon, the winners will always be a few fast people up front. There'd be a huge mob of runners in the middle, gathered about a kind of norm. And then at the tail end, you get all the slow ones and so on.
I think it's called Pareto distribution, no?
Called what?
Pareto distribution.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I thought there was another name for it too. You're probably correct.
It's that only a very small portion of the population is responsible for basically 50% of the productive elements of society. And you can see it, for example, in every field. If you go into classical music, even though you had thousands of composers, just very few of them actually wrote most of the music.
Yes, well, there you go. This is the sort of normal, I think we call in social studies, it's called the normal curve. And some professors, they grade you on the normal curve. They can't give everybody an A or everybody an F or whatever. So they try to end up with a kind of normal distribution. But what I began to see anyway, when I was looking into this for the first time, was if the normal curve holds as a kind of sociological law, then people can never be equal in anything. And equality or a sameness in things is an illusion. That's why I talk about this as the equality illusion. Because if you subdivide anything, provided the sample group is large enough, you will generally reproduce the same normal curve in that section of the book that describes what that is, and kind of puts paid to the notion that you can never have a society rooted in equality. Of course, whenever I'm debating people on this topic, I say, well, that freedom and equality are asymptotic. If you have more of one, you're going to have less of the other. It's like what we used to call a teeter-totter as kids. If one goes up, the other must go down. And this really, equality, people pushing equality are very offended by that notion that there's some kind of dynamic relationship between freedom and, well, I call it forced equality, which is what we're talking about. You know, governments forcing equal outcomes on their populations. Another one, and perhaps we'll end with that, is what I call the determinist illusion. You know, and you're running into this everywhere, this idea that everything in life is determined. And the story I like to quote is the story of the two identical twins who appear before the judge, whatever, and the judge says to the first twin, because they were both raised by a terrible, drunken, alcoholic, quasi-criminal father. And the judge turns to the first twin and he says, "Why are you so bad?" And the twin says, "With a father like mine, who wouldn't be bad?" And the judge says, "Okay." And he turns to the second twin and he says, "Why are you so good?" And he said, "With a father like mine, who wants to be bad?" See, so in the different attitude of those two kids, you got different approaches to the environment, which is, something made me do it. I couldn't help myself. Something made me do it, which we see all around us. And in the freedom notion of the other twin, who basically argues that regardless of my environment, I'm going to say no. And really, even if you go back to philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote a long book called Being and Nothingness, his basic argument about human liberty, because he had trouble putting his finger on it, like, what is it really? What is that capacity to be free? And he basically said, you can argue determinism all you want, and you can construct a chain of events. I have friends who try to do that, a chain of events leading up to what I just did, But he said, no, the essence of freedom is negative. It's the capacity of the human being unpredictably to say no whenever he or she wants. And that's an outward sign of human liberty, which breaks the causal chain that determinists like to rely on. And I'll just give you one more example, because I have this discussion with our discussion group all the time. A couple of them are dyed-in-the-wool scientists, naturalists, determinists guys, And I say, guys, you can't even tell me how you lift your finger. And they say, what? I say, how do you do this? How do you lift your finger? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, the finger is not thinking. It's not deciding to lift itself. How do you lift your finger? And they get into some psychobabble about how I have a habit of lifting my finger, or I've done it so many times, it's easy, and all that kind of stuff. I said, no, you're not answering the question. There's been a decision to lift my finger, and the decision is immaterial. It's not made of anything except thought, and thought is immaterial. So my argument to you, I say to them, is that we are spiritual beings. We are not material beings. We are, if you like, embodied souls. That was Aquinas's term for the human being. I love it. He said, we're embodied souls. We lift our finger with a thought. And the thought, just like the words I'm speaking to you, which may be physical in the sense that there are sound waves traveling to my screen and my microphone picks it up. And Lord knows how, way over there where you are, you can hear what I'm saying. But the words themselves are abstract concepts. They have no material reality. So to me, the most important truth about what a human being is that we are embodied souls, which is why we can speak in concepts, lift our fingers, and do so many other things sourced in our will. Of course, there are autonomic aspects to our being as well. Our breathing, our eating, our bodily functions, these take place whether we will them or not, for the most part, or we quasi-will them sometimes. But
Yes.
the truly meaningful things that make us truly give us the essence of our humanity are completely spiritual. And so far, neither of those two fellows, and I really like them both, but neither of them has ever been able to explain to me how he lifts his finger. They try to say it's a neuron or something. And I say, no, but now you're arguing for what they used to call a homunculus, which is the term they use for a tiny little human being inside your brain who's lifting your finger or pulling a nerve to make your finger come up. But obviously, there's no little human being in your head. There's a thought. and you can't tell me how a immaterial thought does something physical. This, by the way, was Descartes' problem. He distinguished between what he called the res cogitans, which is the brain or the soul, the thinking mind, and the res extensa, which is extended being, by which he meant basically anything physical that you can measure that has depth, breadth, and width, and so on. So he never was able to connect the two either. Descartes couldn't tell you how you lift your finger. So let me say thank you for today. It's been fun.
Thank you very much. Will you be patient for just one question? I think we have one question, please.
Yes.
Yes. Santosh, would you like to go ahead very quickly? No, I guess she's offline or something. So allow me to say thank you. We are very happy and honored to have you here. This is a great pleasure for us, and we will be seeing you again next week.
Yes, but you make me one promise, please.
Yes.
If I haven't bored you already, please be sure you tell me if and when I do, and then
No,
we'll
no,
stop.
no. Please continue to come and share your insights and vast knowledge and life experience. For me personally, this is very important, and I'm sure other people appreciate it a lot.
Thank you for having me again.
Thank you. I will stop the recording and I will send you a copy immediately.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye for
Bye.
now. I'm going to open the floor for free discussions if you guys like.